Bitcoin is either going to zero or infinity. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, you know for a fact that I personally think it's going to infinity, but I want to talk more about how Bitcoin can possibly fail. In this video, we're going to go through multiple scenarios where Bitcoin could potentially go to zero. Let's get started. I want to start with a quick example here of FTX and its token. So FTX is an exchange. They collapsed because it was fraud. You can see it here. FTX customer. This is FTX.com. So if you just go to FTX.com, you'll see that here. FTX.com. FTX customer claims portal enables you to access your FTX account information, obtain historical information, and if necessary, submit an electronic proof of claim in the FTX Chapter 11 proceedings. So they went bankrupt. FTX is no longer in business. They created a token called FTT. And if you take a look at the token, you can see here FTX token FTT. It's only down 50% from the first price that it sold at. So if we go all the way back here, we can see at one point FTT token was at 172. That was seems like the first trade, and today it's worth 84 cents. So even though this business, which is supposed to have created value and then transferred that value into their FTT token, even though this business has failed, the token is still trading for 85 cents because there are probably people who are willing to buy the token. They potentially think that maybe it's going to go back up. They are just holding it as a gamble. And now let's think about what could potentially happen to Bitcoin to make it go to zero. So now you understand that even though FTX, which is supposed to be a business, has failed, the business has failed, FTT token is still trading at 85 cents. It still has value. So what would have to happen for Bitcoin to fail? The way that I see it, Bitcoin cannot go to zero. No matter what happens, Bitcoin can't go to zero. But there are certain scenarios that can make it so that Bitcoin's value potentially drops. And the first scenario is if people stop valuing rarity, they stop valuing scarcity. They stop seeing things that are scarce as valuable, so they don't want to hold them anymore. The base premise of Bitcoin is that it's a scarce token. If people no longer value scarcity, then there's no reason to value Bitcoin. This is almost like saying that human nature is going to change. We're going to stop doing the things that we do innately, the things that we use to drive our species forward. We're going to stop eating. We're going to stop drinking. This is like saying that we're going to remove a part of our brain. We're not going to value things that we found valuable our entire history. For thousands of years, people valued scarcity. And this is like saying that we're not going to follow that anymore. Now, there may be some people who don't value scarcity, and that's perfectly fine. But when you say that all of humanity is going to stop valuing scarcity, then I think that's pretty ridiculous to say. The next way that Bitcoin could potentially start losing value or trend to zero is if there's a massive failure in the code. If Bitcoin's code fails, then people no longer trust it. People no longer use it. I'm not sure how that could happen. I don't have a computer science background. I don't have coding as a background or anything like that. But if it fails, if it changes, or if it does something that's not supposed to, then it's probably going to lose a lot of trust. And while it may be possible to change whatever bugs appeared, there are going to be certain people who never trust Bitcoin again. And that's perfectly fine because there are going to be other people who are still going to trust it and they're going to still use it as they understand that Bitcoin's code has been repaired and it can now be used as money again. This isn't going to bring Bitcoin down to zero because there are still going to be people who want Bitcoin. Even if the code doesn't work, maybe they'll want it as a collectible. Bringing Bitcoin back down to zero today, like I showed you with FTT token, is nearly impossible, even if the code fails. People may sell it, but other people will still want to buy it. Like I said, the underlying for the FTT token failed, and people still want that token. They're still willing to pay something like 85 cents for it. The next way that Bitcoin could potentially fail is if governments become fiscally responsible. Even then, I don't think Bitcoin will fail. I think it'll keep working the way that it is today. It'll still be a scarce asset. The thing with governments is that there's a risk associated. When you trust them to be fiscally responsible, you don't know if they will be fiscally responsible. They may claim to be, They may claim to say that there's going to be no more wars, there's going to be no more spending on things that we don't really need, but there's no guarantee that they'll stick to their promises and they'll do what they say. Having money that's centrally controlled gives governments and financial institutions an arbitrage opportunity. They can print money, they can do nothing, and they can earn money for lending that money that they printed to other people. So what they're doing is they're creating something out of thin air, they're lending it to other people, and they're earning interest from that money that they created out of nothing. So this is an arbitrage opportunity until banks can no longer earn money for doing nothing. Our financial system will continue to work the way it does, and governments will continue to spend money the way that they do. If people value pieces of paper, then other people will exploit them and they'll take advantage of them and they'll use their savings to do whatever they want. So your government is going to print more money. They're going to dilute your savings. If you save in the money that they print, they're going to print more money. They're going to dilute your savings and they're going to use that money to do whatever they want to. So saying that governments are going to become fiscally responsible doesn't really make any sense because they have this ability to do whatever they want to. Why would they not choose to enrich themselves if they can? If they want to retain the current financial structure, then they have to print more and more money to support it. And they have to keep adding more and more money to the system. And they have to take power away from the people who can potentially shake things up. Bitcoin is the complete opposite of this. So with Bitcoin, if we do go to a Bitcoin standard, governments can no longer print money. They don't have to say that they're not going to print money. It's already known that they can't print any more money. If they tried to print money, everybody is going to know. And whatever money they tried to print, whatever Bitcoin they tried to print, is not going to be used in the economy. This website is called mempool.space. What it shows you is all of the transactions that have ever happened on the Bitcoin blockchain. A blockchain is just a chain of blocks. These are blocks that contain transactions. So this is a chain of blocks, and each of those blocks has transactions in it. So what you can do here is you can go through any of these blocks and you can look at the transactions that are in them. So for example, if we go into this block here, 903791, you can see here transaction for $1,436 or 1.3 million Satoshis. Another one here for 1.7 million Satoshis, another one for 5 million Satoshis, and so on. We can see all of the transactions that have ever happened on the Bitcoin blockchain. If governments are somehow able to manipulate that and they're able to change the blockchain, the record of transactions on everybody's computers, and keep in mind that this isn't only held in one location, it's held all around the world. If governments are somehow able to change that record on every single computer where that record exists, then of course Bitcoin has been completely overtaken. It will probably go to zero because there's really no value. Governments can start increasing the supply if they want to. So that's another situation where, let's say, governments try to be fiscally responsible with Bitcoin, but they have this power now where they can create more of it. It breaks the entire system. So Bitcoin stops working the way that it does. But fortunately, they can't do this. In order to take over the Bitcoin network, they'd have to attack all of these 22,217 nodes, which are the ones that are carrying the Bitcoin blockchain. So all of these computers have a record of the Bitcoin blockchain, 22,000 computers. There are hard drives that hold it. There are computers that aren't even registered on here that hold the blockchain, a record of the blockchain. And if governments want to corrupt this somehow, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to attack all of these computers. They're going to have to attack all of these computers to change the supply. And the likelihood of that is nearly zero. The fourth way that Bitcoin could potentially fail is if governments start a gold backed currency. I think the likelihood of this is very, very low. I don't think it could actually make Bitcoin fail. Theoretically, maybe it could, but in reality, even with a gold backed currency, Bitcoin would still have a lot of value because a gold backed currency means that somebody else is holding the gold and maybe you have no idea where that gold is. Maybe you have no idea if that gold actually exists. And that's why fiat exists today. Fiat exists today the way that it does, where banks can print as much as they want to because governments and financial institutions were able to take all of the gold out of the market. They were able to take all of the stronger money out of the market, the money that was being used for transactions, and they were able to replace it with gold certificates or IOUs. So over time, the amount of IOUs can be printed and printed and printed, while the amount of gold can't. Governments were able to create the current financial system because gold can't be tracked. I've seen reports that show that the gold in Fort Knox, the biggest stash of gold in the world, is going to take a year and a half to count. So no matter what happens, even if you have a gold backed currency, you have to trust whoever holds that gold to actually have that gold. What the person who you're trusting to create your currency can do is they can create more of that currency, they can hold on to your gold, they can stop you from ever taking your gold back, and they can completely just corrupt the system in their own favor. And that's exactly how things are working out today. When the US government prints money and it does whatever it wants with it, it hurts everybody else on earth because everybody else's savings are being diluted. You'd be surprised how many people use the US dollar and not stocks, bonds, real estate to save. They just hold on to dollars because that's the only form of money that they have access to. You can't really access, let's say, an ounce of gold if you don't have $3,000. And most people on earth don't have $3,000. You can have smaller amounts of gold, but maintaining and managing that gold is extremely difficult. You could easily lose these little shavings of gold and you could lose all of your savings. The way that Bitcoin works is a little bit different. You can own as much or as little as you want to, and the barrier to entry is just about the same for everyone because the transaction fees that exchanges charge, for example, is around 1 to 2%. The good thing with Bitcoin is that you can get paid in it, unlike stocks, unlike real estate. You can get paid in Bitcoin. You can have a wallet on your phone. And you can have payments set up so that they go directly to that wallet. Think about all of the possibilities here. If somebody wants to start a business in a country that's sanctioned by the US and can't access the current financial system, they would have no opportunity to really create value other than with the currency that the current government in their country uses. Now with Bitcoin, we have a currency that is decentralized. Nobody controls it. Nobody can print it. Nobody can censor you from using it. Nobody can stop you from accessing it. The alternative to this would be a currency that's centralized. It can be printed. You can be diluted. There's no way to confirm that you'll have value tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, because if trust in that financial system goes away, then the entire financial system collapses. So let me refresh that for you. Reason number 4 that Bitcoin could potentially fail is because of gold backed currencies, but I think the likelihood of that is nearly zero. The fifth way that Bitcoin could potentially fail is if we create powerful enough quantum computers that can break SHA-256 and take Bitcoin out of wallets that are holding it for long-term savings. This is the one that I'm the most worried about, and it has the highest likelihood of happening, but the chances of it happening in the short term are very low. I think if it does happen, it'll probably take maybe 5 to 7 years. And by then, there will be some kind of patch that makes Bitcoin resistant to quantum computing. So all of those are potential reasons for Bitcoin to fail. Again, the chances of them are very low. The most likely one is probably quantum computing because technology is always going to improve. But over time, we're going to find fixes for that. And I don't think that'll be a problem over the long term. A lot of people think that Bitcoin could potentially fail because of the volatility. But the way that I see it, Bitcoin is not volatile. One Bitcoin is going to be worth one Bitcoin no matter what. Just like today, people see that $1 is worth $1. The only difference here is that if you have one Bitcoin, the value of that Bitcoin is going to keep increasing because the denominator, the number of Bitcoin that can exist, is never going to increase. In the case of the US dollar, the denominator is going to keep increasing forever. So your $1 may be worth $1, but the real purchasing power of that dollar is going to keep decreasing. You're going to be able to buy less food with it. You're going to be able to buy less shelter with it. You're going to be able to buy fewer things that you really need to survive with that dollar over time. Bitcoin's price in terms of dollars may be volatile in the short term, but over the long term, it only goes up. This volatility doesn't make a difference to Bitcoin's true purpose. The people who save in Bitcoin just believe that they have a certain amount of Bitcoin. If you have one Bitcoin, it doesn't matter what the value in terms of dollars is. All that matters is you have one Bitcoin. You have the private keys that control one whole Bitcoin. This applies, of course, to zero point 0.1 Bitcoin, 0.01 Bitcoin. One Satoshi is equal to one Satoshi, no matter what happens. In the case of Bitcoin, the supply is determined using math. And this is what the math essentially works out to be. Over time, we're going to top out at just under 21 million Bitcoin. No matter what happens, this supply can't be increased. If somebody tries to increase the supply, there's going to be a new implementation of Bitcoin that just completely takes their power and their control away. So, for example, if a Bitcoin implementation like Bitcoin Core tries to change the Bitcoin supply, people are going to move over to a different implementation that doesn't change the total supply of Bitcoin. This is what the supply of Bitcoin looks like. We can see here the orange the new supply of Bitcoin, and this is what the total supply of Bitcoin, the blue, looks like. So we can see here the new supply keeps decreasing and decreasing until it eventually reaches zero. The total supply keeps increasing and increasing and increasing until it eventually reaches as close to 21 million as possible. As more people figure this out, they're going to want Bitcoin. So the chances of Bitcoin going to infinity are much, much higher because more and more money can go into Bitcoin. Anyone from anywhere in the world can put their value into Bitcoin. They can convert the value that they have in the fiat currency financial system into Bitcoin, and they can use Bitcoin to save for the future. The good thing about Bitcoin is that if you have a long time horizon, it makes you more prosperous. So if you have a certain amount of money, you put into Bitcoin, you have a 4 or 5, 10-year time horizon, you're going to be able to purchase way more things in the future with the same amount of Bitcoin. So what this does is it gets people to delay gratification. So they hold Bitcoin for longer and longer terms, and they decrease the amount of Bitcoin that's available to be bought. With the way that supply and demand works, because Bitcoin has a finite supply and there's always going to be people who want to buy Bitcoin, the price can't go to zero. There are people who have orders for 21 million Bitcoin at 1 cent per coin. If Bitcoin goes to a penny, why wouldn't some random person put $5 into Bitcoin, buy 500 coins, take all of that supply off the market, and just hold it as a lottery ticket? It doesn't make sense to think that Bitcoin is going to zero because none of the fundamentals have changed. The fundamentals have been exactly the same since the very first block was created. The very first transaction was added to the network. The supply has remained exactly the same. You can see the exact dates when the supply changed. So thinking that Bitcoin is going to zero because number one, people will suddenly stop valuing Bitcoin, or number two, the supply is going to change is completely ridiculous. It's like thinking that we probably shouldn't save for the future because the earth is going to explode. The chances of Bitcoin going to zero keep decreasing as more and more people figure it out, as they realize that this is the only finite supply asset in the world, and they want to contribute their time, their energy, and their resources to the Bitcoin network. As more people discover Bitcoin, the network becomes more powerful and the chances of it going to zero fall even further. Of course, the chances of it going to zero can never really be zero because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what could happen in the short term that could completely destroy Bitcoin's credibility. With that being said, I don't personally think it's going to zero. I think it's going to go up forever. I think infinity is the future because Bitcoin has a finite supply while US dollars don't. So the only thing that I would recommend again is to stack Bitcoin to make sure that you have Bitcoin for a future where Bitcoin does go to infinity and it is the world reserve currency and everything is priced in Bitcoin. The way that I see it, at some point, the world will recognize that Bitcoin is energy stored on the internet using incorruptible software. And if you want to pay for something, you're going to have to use Bitcoin in order to get it.